Hello, and welcome to the fourth NIHR Dementia Researcher Midday Lecture webinar. I'm Adam Smith, and I'm the Programme Director for the NIHR National Director for Dementia Research, and I'm based at University College London. And today I'm delighted to welcome Dr. James Quinn. Hello, James.
Hello, Adam.
Last year, James completed his PhD at the University of Manchester, and now he works as a postdoc research fellow in the Alzheimer's Clinical Trial Research Unit at Massachusetts General Hospital in the States. For those who listen to our podcast, some of you may already be familiar with James's work, because I think you joined us at the AAIC for our daily podcasts in 2019 and 18, is that right?
Exactly, Adam. Well done.
James's research focuses on trying to improve the understanding the molecular cellular mechanisms that lead to different forms of dementia, studying the role of neuropeptides. However, the focus for today's talk won't be on his research, but on pursuing a postdoc and how to ensure the perfect fit for your PhD position. Something he has some recent experience of, having made this rather big move from Manchester to the States. You can find out more about James and his work through his bio, which is published on our website. The talk will be around 20 minutes, and then we have 10 minutes for questions at the end, which we'll answer live. So if you have any questions, please use the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen to post those there, and I'll read them out to him at the end. So we're recording today's lecture as well, so if you drop out, don't worry, you can watch this back via our website at dementiaresearcher.nihr.ac.uk/webinars, probably from sometime tomorrow. So thank you very much for everybody for joining us. Over to you, James, if you could maybe share your screen now.
So I'll just quickly overview the presentations and talk a little bit about my personal experience of applying for postdocs, help you try and decide whether a postdoc's right for you, look at different careers outside of doing a postdoc, looking to identify supervisors in your research team, how to secure an offer. I'm going to talk a little bit about moving abroad or even institutions within your own country, and then trying to summarize a little bit at the end. And we'll have an opportunity for questions at the end, and as Adam said, just put it in the kind of Q&A box. So I'll talk a little bit about my personal experience first. So I did my biology degree at the University of Sussex. This is a photo of graduation with me and the Chancellor, Sanjeev Bhaskar. Then I moved to do my PhD in the lab with Professor Nigel Hooper at the University of Manchester, and this was looking at tau and its role in Alzheimer's and other tauopathies. And then I went on to do my research fellowship at Mass Gen. So this seems like a very linear track, kind of degree, PhD, research fellowship. And I should add, this is a three-year position. So unfortunately, this was not the case. Things never go as expected, and this is what I'm going to try and kind of get across in this talk. So I actually had my first conversation about doing a postdoc at the EuroTau conference back in 2018. There was a group at the University of Gothenburg that had been attending EuroTau in 2017 and in 2018, and I met them in 2017, had a little bit of discussion, and I basically reached out to them kind of beginning of April 2018 and said, I'd love to do a postdoc in your lab. I want to apply for funding to potentially work with you. I've got this idea of a project. So I applied to Alzheimer's Research UK International Travelling Fellowship or something along those lines. And that was working with this group at the University of Gothenburg. So they actually paid for me to come out and visit. I've now watched Midsummer, the film, and this is it was actually around the time of Midsummer. So this is definitely has different connotations, this picture to me now. But I had a really, really good trip out there, really good conversations about kind of working. We spoke about if I didn't get the fellowship, they would be able to support me for 2 years. I got some stuff down in writing about doing a postdoc with the aim to start in 2019. So I went back to the UK, finished up my PhD. Kind of after finishing my PhD, I joined a consulting firm just outside of Manchester as an analyst intern. This is in Bollington in Macclesfield, and this is where the company was based. And this is this very weird structure called White Nancy on the top of a hill overlooking Bollington. You can also see Manchester as well. No idea what it's for, but it fascinated me enough to kind of put the photo up in here. And then I went traveling around South America. This was something I always wanted to do. I always wanted to go traveling after finishing my PhD. So I've got the obligatory photo of me and an alpaca. And this was all really good. So the plan was finish my PhD, do a bit of consulting as a kind of interim between my finishing my PhD and having my Viva, which was great because I was still getting paid. There was no money for me to stay in the lab. So I still had money coming in and was kind of learning new skills. And then I went traveling. I remember I was rebutting the comments to my fellowship application while at a hostel in Brazil, which was certainly an experience, but I think that was all a really good experience. And the plan was basically to come back after traveling and then start the postdoc in the new year, so kind of January, February time. Had all this down in writing, but it never really materialized for reasons out of my control. And essentially I was kind of kept emailing the group at Gothenburg and I was never hearing anything back. It turns out there was big structural changes that were happening, and that just meant that there was no one really there pushing my case, unfortunately. So as I'm going to try and get across, sometimes these things happen, especially when you plan kind of so far in advance. So this is a very stressful time. But what actually happened was, in terms of me getting my postdoc, is I attended AIC in Chicago. The second time attending the first time attending AIC, because I attended last year, which was a really good experience. At the conference, I met my now supervisor, Becky Carlisle. She came up to me on a poster and said, "Oh, I really like the biomarker work you're doing. We've got a lot of samples of patients here in Boston. We would like to collaborate. And if you guys need any samples, like send us an email." And I said, basically, I'm finishing my PhD. I can't really help, but I'll put you in touch with someone in my lab. So I essentially set up this collaboration between Mass Gen and University of Manchester. And then kind of out of nowhere, I got an email from my old supervisor back at Manchester saying, "Oh, Becky was asking if you've got a position. I know you've got a few things kind of that you're looking at. Do you want to reach out to her and see kind of what's happening?" So I emailed Becky and I had sent over my CV. She told me a little bit about the project. I had a Skype interview with her and my other boss, Stephen, Dr. Stephen Arnold. And this culminated in me being flown out to Boston for my postdoc interview. This was in February. Then kind of had the interview. It went really well. I really enjoyed the lab. And then basically started the process of getting my visa. In the interim of this period between February and April, I had rejoined the consulting firm, which was great because it meant that I still had some money coming in, and went to the US Embassy. And I got my visa. It's a J1 visa for those who are interested. And that was in April. And then I flew out to Boston in May of last year. So I'm going to help you try and understand whether a postdoc is the right thing for you. I found these great little comics online. I think my favorite one is this little one in the left corner, postdocs are mentors. Don't become a postdoc. I don't ever want to tell someone to do a postdoc. I always want to help them think if a postdoc is the right career option for them, instead of just saying, don't do it. Because I actually think they can be extremely useful. You can take a look at these different comics. And then, so really trying to pin down whether you think a postdoc's right. So really take time to think through your options. Are you doing a postdoc because you have nothing else to do? This was something I kind of did originally, but then when I joined the consulting firm, I realized I don't want to do consulting for the rest of my life. I don't want to be sat in an office. I want to be doing bench science research. Do you want to do a postdoc because your PhD supervisor recommended it to you? This is what I hear a lot. A PhD supervisor will say, "Oh, there's this lab looking for a new postdoc. Do you want to join as soon as you've finished your PhD?" Think about it, whether this is actually something you want to do, not what you're kind of expected to do. What do you hope to get out of a postdoc? For me, it was the opportunity to travel, opportunity to learn new skills, work in a different lab, kind of all of these different things. And what research do you want to do? I was quite clear that I wanted to do something around biomarkers, and joining a clinical research team was really helpful for that. Where would you be comfortable moving to? I always said I didn't want to do a postdoc in the UK because I wanted to explore working in a different country. And a reminder, a postdoc is a trainee position. Again, another comic, but essentially, I don't know if I fully agree with this one, but I would say you're kind of equal between doing your research and looking at where you're going next, because that's really what your research is doing. If you focus too hard on just looking at your next position, you will forget about your research and vice versa. So I think it's really important to be doing both, looking at your future career options as well as performing your research. I just went through and just picked out every single career option that I could think about that are kind of relevant to kind of people coming out with PhDs or people who are coming out with postdocs. And there's a lot of jobs out there, a lot more than you kind of think about. And all of these have some element of science in them, or they have element in management, or they have elements that are very useful that you've taken from your PhD, and kind of whatever area it is. I mean, I'm much more focused on bench science, but I can see people who are coming in from much more a qualitative type of PhD or a psychology PhD, that these are very, very transferable skills into these as well. So how to really go about identifying supervisors and your research team. So the way I looked at it was people first, then place, then project. But what are your priorities? This can change. Some people are only focused on the science, but you want to be doing science in a good lab. So these are my two supervisors, Becky Carlisle and Stephen Arnold. And I really liked having two supervisors. It worked really well in my PhD, and I thought it would work well again for my postdoc. Becky has much more of the wet lab experience, so she's done a ton of experiments and is actually from the UK, but has been at Yale for 7 years before joining Mass Gen. And then Stephen, who is a clinician, so he's seeing patients kind of once a week, and he's also running clinical trials. So this is great for me because I'm getting a completely different exposure than what I got during my PhD, and I feel like the research I'm doing is much more translational. And the team was great. This photo was taken from our end of summer barbecue last year. So how to go about kind of identifying supervisors in a research area. Think about what mentorship worked for you. Do you want a similar style supervisor to your PhD, or do you want someone different? I'd seen kind of from my consulting job what type of supervising worked for me in that sort of position. So I was like, okay, I'm looking for someone similar, and in terms of career trajectory and all of these things, and someone that I could actually kind of actively learn from in the lab. And reach out to your network. Have you already met potential supervisors at conferences? As you can see, like, you can go about and make those, initiate those conversations yourself by saying that you are looking to apply for funding, but does your lab have funding? Can your contacts recommend supervisors for you? Check on Twitter. I actually found a postdoc on Twitter. Someone just put out a link and sent an email, met them at a conference, and you can start those sorts of conversations. I would never just like straight up apply. I would always try and get in touch with the supervisor, see if you can organize a visit, and going with a much more kind of personalized strategy. Outs Forum occasionally has postdocs on there, and Dementia Researcher. There's jobs going on there all the time. And as you can see, most postdoc positions are not advertised. Try and reach out 6 to 12 months in advance. But you can see with my experience at University of Gothenburg, I did do that and it kind of never materialized. Turns out it would have been, I finally got the email to say that they've been able to sort out the system in place, and the job would have come up about end of March, early April. So you can imagine if I hadn't had organized the other position, I would have been waiting a very long time and a very stressful time. So someone reached out to me, and this was kind of pretty great for me, but there are a lot of supervisors out there who are looking for postdocs. So you have a lot of sway in terms of what sort of lab you want to go to, especially if you reach out yourself instead of just kind of relying on other people to give you supervisors. So how to go about securing an offer. There's a kind of general interview structure. So PhD student or post-PhD student approaches a PI, so a principal investigator, for kind of an informal discussion. So that could just be an email to say, I'm attending this conference, do you want to chat? That sort of level of conversation. Even if you happen to be in the same country. I remember I was traveling around Germany for a beer festival, and I just added on an extra couple of days at the end to go visit a lab. So I think you kind of got to make it what you can of it. There's an informal interview over email, Skype or Zoom, and then there'll be a formal interview in person. So you'll fit with the group. You'll be expected to give an approximately hour-long presentation. I've given these presentations before in Germany, for example, and I had the lab come up to me and say, do not join this lab if you want to kind of carry on your career. And that was someone that kind of I had recommended to me to join their lab. So I think really seeing that is probably the most important thing you can do, because if the people in the lab are telling you not to join, do not join. There are a lot of other postdocs out there. Just because the research seems interesting is not enough to kind of join that group. the formal interview, how it worked for me in Boston. I kind of came, I flew in the night before, stayed at a hotel, and in the morning I went over to the lab to give an 8 a.m. lab meeting, which was, I think, I was very jet lagged. It was a bit of a mess, but I remember I came and I brought biscuits for the group, and they really enjoyed the presentation, but everyone remembered the biscuits. So just doing something to show that you're a human being is probably the most important thing you can do. And it was kind of the link to being British as well. And they really liked that, and it went down really well. And also kind of talking about what you do in your PhD and what you hope to get out of your postdoc, and kind of what you can bring to the group. So I talked a bit about social media, I talked a little bit about conferences, I talked a little bit about public engagement, and all these different things that like look really good from a lab, and people aren't going to want to only bond with you over what you do for your research. So the postdoc offer will be granted, and then there'll be discussions started on the offer. So I put here, are you willing to take a postdoc at a place you haven't visited? Most labs won't support travel. I had to really push for Boston to fly me out. They said they wouldn't do it normally, but I said, I won't join if you won't fly me out. I said that to other labs, and they said, we don't have the ability to fly you out, which is fine. And I just, if you have the choice, try and visit, but if you can't, I remember a group said, we won't fly you out unless you sign the contract, which I kind of thought was a bit counterintuitive, but it's just how it works in individual institutions. But even if you can get something like, if you can't visit, try and organize a Skype with every single person in the lab, email ex-members from the lab. There are a lot of different things you can do to kind of identify whether it's the right place for you. So again here, it's basically kind of a postdoc is kind of the end of your PhD or grad school, where you're writing things that aren't a thesis, you're doing a lot of experiments, and you're pretty competent, you kind of know what you're doing. And kind of you gain a bit of respect as well. But it's a kind of weird level of respect because you're there with for how it works here. We don't have PhD students in our lab, we just have technicians who are probably equally as experienced as me as in the lab, or more experienced. And I kind of sit between them and management. So there's a kind of weird dichotomy, but it works really well. So I feel like I'm kind of comfortable with both groups, comfortable with both management, comfortable with the technicians as well in the group as well, which it works really well for me. So I'll talk a little bit about contract length and visas. Do not rely on word of mouth, make sure everything is signed and in writing. Sometimes that's not even enough, as I showed with Gothenburg, but Boston were super quick. So you can just see how much a group wants you as well, and that's kind of a big indicator as well for making your decision. And until you've signed the contract, you can be looking at 10 postdocs. There is no obligation, and there's also no obligation to stay. So I've got a 3-year position. I want to stay for a minimum of 2 years, but if another position comes up, you're going to take it. You're not kind of like in a PhD, you can't just leave, well, you could just leave halfway through, but there's less of that kind of end goal there. You kind of want to find out if there's funding to support your entire contract length. So I'm funded for 3 years, or is an expectation for you to get your own funding. So it could be, I've seen people get, okay, you've got 1 year, then you have to find your own funding. Do you need a visa? And all of this is a lengthy process and costs money. Is there money available to help with relocation? There wasn't for me in Boston, but my boss helped me. So my boss said, I can let you sublet my old apartment, or she came and picked me up kind of from the airport. So there's a lot of things a boss can do, and that will tell you a lot about kind of joining their research group as well, to see how kind of helpful they are. Talk about salary and benefits. In America, they're very strict on NIH, so National Institute of Health pay scales, but there is some freedom to negotiate depending on where you are, really. I've seen in academia, depending on where you do your postdoc, you can kind of negotiate that. And in industry as well, you can have some ability to negotiate that. You want to be asking me things about expecting working hours, conferences, travel, supervising and teaching. I can remember my first week or two in my postdoc, my boss came up to me at 4 p.m. on a Friday and said, "What do you need? Do you still need to be here?" And that's very different from my PhD, where I kind of felt like I always had to be working. So that was really good to see. And if you can kind of ask those questions early on, that would be really helpful. So a bit of advice about moving abroad or even institutions. Plan meticulously. Everything takes longer than expected. It is a stressful experience, but try to enjoy it. I wasn't happy about not going to Sweden. I was a bit kind of like, my whole plan had been destroyed. But when everything started falling into place with Boston, I started to enjoy it a lot more because I felt like something was going to happen there. And rejoining a consulting firm was a lot of fun. I really liked the people I was working with there. Taking photocopies of all important documents. In America, they're super strict about what documents you need to have with you at all time, but just having photocopies or having photos of them on your phone is super helpful. And get advice from others who have moved from your country to the country of interest, or even institutions. So you might know someone who, for example, at Manchester has moved to University College London, or vice versa, and get advice from them, because there are lots of little things that they can kind of help you out with. And I say allow at least 6 months to become comfortable working in a brand new lab or research group. It took me ages to learn where the pipettes are, how to order things, all of these things. And this is probably similar even if you're doing a non kind of lab-based research. So in conclusion, kind of learn to embrace the unexpected and have lots of different backup plans. Take time to decide whether a postdoc is the right fit for you. Postdocs are trainee positions. There are lots of alternative careers out there. People, project, place, and try and identify what your priorities are. Most postdoc positions aren't actually advertised because they get filled before they even think about advertising them. Expect to be interviewed for the position, get everything signed in writing. Moving abroad takes a lot of time and it's quite stressful, and give yourself 6 months to settle into the position. And finally, I love my postdoc. I love being in Boston, and I'm super happy with my move over here. So I'd just like to end, open the floor for any questions. There's a nice photo of Boston I took a couple of weeks back, and then just advertise the next webinar, which is happening on April 22nd at 1 p.m. GMT. For anyone who's viewing from America, that's 8 a.m. Eastern Standard Time. Just for the purpose of the recording, I'm going to link to the additional information and sources I used. So if you're interested, you have a look. There's probably more out there, but I just kind of found a few that was kind of published recently that looked kind of interesting. And I kind of use those to help formulate my presentation. So I'll just leave it on this slide for now while we go into any questions.
Fantastic. Thank you very much, James. While we wait for anybody who has questions, if you post those in the Q&A at the bottom of the screen there, I have a couple. Is the work you're doing now something which is driven by your own interests, or was it specified this is what we want you to do when you come here?
Yeah, so my boss Becky had funding from Bright Focus, which is a charity that funds Alzheimer's and macular degeneration research here in the US. And it said, you've got 3 years to do this project. It was pretty much established what would happen year 1, year 2, year 3. But there's some freedom of what I am to do with the project. And there's options for me to, let's say something came up for my PhD that they couldn't do in Manchester, but they needed someone to kind of help out with some experiments. But my boss, Becky, said I can do those sorts of projects. So there's some freedom, but there is an expectation of what I am to be working on, but they align with my research interests. So I've seen if you obviously have your own money, then if you have your own fellowship funding, you can do your own project. But it kind of needs to fit within the scope of the lab, kind of irrespective.
Could you stop your screen share now?
Yes.
Thank you. We do have a couple of questions. I'm just going to put another one before we go to this. So I think what's interesting here is highlighting the importance, again, this has come up so many times in our podcasts, about the whole networking piece, about making the most out of conferences, particularly at that kind of time of career where you are, is going out of your way to find people who have similar interests to you, and being a little bit brash in asking the question, saying, are there any opportunities in your lab if they really are not so advertised? So that it's a good point. So, okay, so let's go to our questions. The first one we have from Martha Mampy. She asks, any tips for someone who does not have the option to relocate due to family reasons?
So I think that is the best time to be talking to your supervisor, from your PhD, or kind of from wherever you're coming from, because they will be able to say whether they have money. So if you want to stay in the same lab, if you can't, you can also look at, so I've seen a few people that do, so I've got friends from Manchester who commute down to London for their postdoc. So they would spend 5 days a week in London. But for example, some projects, I know she can do a lot of her project in Manchester because a lot of it's bioinformatics. So a lot of it is just computer based, especially at the moment. She is quarantining because of COVID-19. So she's able to kind of completely work from home. So I think having those sorts of discussions, finding out what research is going on within your institute or institutes, other local institutes, and just really seeing kind of what's available within your local area. And Adam will be a great person to talk to about that, because dementia research is constantly putting up jobs kind of in your local area.
We are. I think it's interesting. Obviously, there's been this tradition, hasn't there, about pressure to move around, that your career won't be its best unless you've moved between different institutions. But I know numerous people.
It's not true.
Exactly. I don't think it's a bit of an old-fashioned view that you have to move from place to place now to make the most of your career.
I know people at Manchester who did their PhD in Manchester, did a postdoc at Manchester, now got a fellowship at Manchester. So you do not have to move. Because I think funders now finally understand that not everyone can move. For me, it was very much a personal decision. I want to explore working in another country, but it very much depends on kind of your personal situation. As long as you can, and no one cares. Like, I mean, if I was trying to fund a project, I care about the science. Because someone's not moved institutes, does that really matter? It probably means you're more productive.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you for that question. We've got another one now from Chloe Hall, who asks, in interviews, are they more interested to hear about your research you've conducted already, example PhD, or what you plan to do in their lab? And which do you focus on when doing your presentation?
So I actually think mine was probably 50-50. So I kind of introduced who I was, and then I talked about what I did in my PhD, and then what I hoped to do in the postdoc. So there was a natural progression. Now, obviously, if you're applying for a postdoc, that is completely different from your PhD. I mean, mine had very similar links, so I was able to link it in. I was working on basically just different proteins that I'm working on now. So I think it very much depends on what you're doing your PhD in. Obviously, change that ratio. I think being able to show that you've been able to complete research is a very important thing to do. And if someone was looking to apply for a postdoc in our group, seeing that they've been able to successfully do things is extremely important. But I remember during my PhD, we had postdocs come and interview, and they only talked about what they did in their PhD. And really, we don't care, because your PhD obviously sets you up well for your postdoc, but people are coming in from different fields, people are changing fields, people are moving research areas. So being able to say, okay, this is what I learned in my PhD, and this is how I hope to then use those skills into the postdoc is probably the most important thing you can do. And showing that you're like a real human, but just trying to show that you've got more than just your PhD. I remember I had one of my friends look over my presentation. I had pictures when I was traveling around South America, just to kind of show like there is more to me than just my research, and putting a kind of human face on it.
So talking about your PhD, but being succinct in maybe just keeping that to the outputs rather than discussing the whole process or giving your life story behind it. As you say, bringing something personal in there to show you. I know that always comes up at university. I mean, similar to university interviews, isn't it? In showing that you're a rounded person, you have interests outside of this kind of work, and that kind of inquisitive mind. I think being prepared to answer questions, things like what books you've read recently, which sounds ridiculous, but I've known these questions to come up, and using real life examples from your PhD and answering the questions about how you deal with failure, how you deal with certain challenges, and having some real life examples prepared and pre-thought through.
And just an example for industry, I've heard in industry interviews, they would get you just do an hour-long talk about something that isn't your PhD work or isn't your postdoc work. So I think being able to talk about things that aren't what you do, but are still science, or talking about things that you do kind of outside. I've heard people say do an hour-long presentation on anything that isn't what you've done before. So like, I mean, really, it kind of depends on kind of where you're going. But I think showing that, because people in the postdoc unless it's very, very closely aligned to your PhD, aren't really going to care too much about what you've done before, just what skills you've learned and how you can transition those over. I remember I just had a little table, what I'd done in my PhD, wrote a review, submitted a grant, submitted a fellowship, and just literally just put, this is what I'm able to do.
Yeah.
Because that shows that you can actually do certain things instead of really kind of going on too long about those, really.
There's some visual bullet points. Thank you for that question. We've got another one now from Emma Jones. Great talk, thanks. Do you have any tips for approaching supervisors you're interested in at a conference, and how do you start that conversation without appearing too smarmy and creepy?
Great question. I really think having that email before, 2 or 3 weeks before the conference, is a good thing. I've heard mixed reviews on this. I don't know this. I've heard PIs say they don't like it. I've heard PIs say they do like it. So I think kind of saying, okay, I'm going to be at this conference. Can we arrange to meet for 15 minutes to talk about doing a potential postdoc in your lab, is a good thing to say. I would not send anything more than that. I would not say, but unless you've already spoken to them before. I was fortunate with the group at Gothenburg. I'd met them in 2017 at a conference, and they asked me to help with one of their projects. So I already had that kind of link there. Yeah. And really, unless you've got something to say, don't say anything. I think is a bit of good advice as well. Like, there's no point just approaching someone unless you've got a clear kind of goal in mind. So maybe do a bit of research, look at their lab, pick out some interesting papers that they've done before, and just come up to them and say, oh, I love that paper you published a year ago about X, Y, and Z. It really kind of gave me some interesting ideas around this. Could we talk about it a little bit more? I'm looking to do a postdoc. Do you have that kind of funding available, or would you need me to bring my own funding? And just be very clear about what you want to get out of that conversation.
So keeping it short in terms of the emails, keeping it short and succinct. I think we've all received those emails where somebody gives their entire life story. And let's face it, I think most PIs probably don't necessarily take all the time to read through all that, because they will receive lots of requests. So kind of short, succinct emails. I think in terms of the conferences is taking time to know in advance who's going to be there, so you're not taken by surprise. I know so many of us wait until we arrive at the AIC and get the program books to start trawling through and see who's presenting what on what day. I think taking the time to read those in advance and have your kind of list of people already and who you're going to talk to, and which conference, which talks you want to stay at for afterwards is probably quite important.
And another bit of advice there is, if you can say, I'm presenting on this day, can you come along? Because I remember there was someone I was interested in doing a postdoc with, who I'd been having an email back and forth, and I said, oh, I'm going to be presenting my research this day. She came to watch my presentation. We chatted after. So it gave that kind of, okay, like, you can see what I've done, even if it's just a poster or if it's an actual presentation. And if people are interested in you and you're presenting, they will come to you. So, I mean, Becky came to me at my poster. I was lucky that I wasn't really that interested in the poster I was presenting, because I was kind of like, this is not my main PhD research. I'm just kind of helping out others in the lab because they weren't able to attend. And then she came up to me. So I think it's a bit of luck. It's a bit of kind of making your own, and making your own luck, really. Just putting those emails out there, and don't be kind of disheartened if you don't get a response. And if you don't get a response, just go up to them and say, I emailed you a couple of weeks ago about this. To be honest, so a lot of PIs I know think they've responded to emails and they just haven't. So I think just then if they don't respond, just go and talk to them at the conference and say, oh, I emailed you a couple of weeks back about this. What do you think? Because they probably looked at it but just didn't have the time to respond.
I think also as well, I know a couple of people who haven't been afraid to ask their PhD supervisors if they've heard of things, if they'd like to help with the introductions, because I think whilst many are keen to keep people, they're also keen to support their PhD students to progress.
And if you know a PhD student in their lab as well, that's helpful, because it's the same thing, isn't it? If you say, I want to talk to this PhD student, that PhD student can then introduce you to their PI. So you can do it kind of different ways. Having someone at the same level as you is helpful, be it PI and your PI you and a PhD student to then go up to the PI. It kind of helps that transition and makes it a little bit more comfortable.
Facilitating those introductions. If you know some PhD and then the PhD emails them and says, "Hi, I wanted to introduce James. He's doing this great work here.
Yeah.
Thought you might be interested in meeting each other." Good thought. Okay, we've got another question from Honor Pollard, who I recognise that name, from Alzheimer's Research UK. She's asking, are there any cultural differences between your lab and the US compared to the UK? Good question.
That is a good question. I mean, my boss is British, so that's definitely a difference, but her boss is American. So I think overall Alzheimer's clinical trial research unit at Mass Gen is predominantly like an American lab. There are definite cultural differences, things like holidays. I mean, I get 15 days holiday a year, which compared to the UK is half what you'd get in the UK. And really there's some expectations about going home for Christmas, and things like that. It's definitely probably the biggest cultural expectation barrier that's different. But I'd say everything else pretty similar. We have when we are working in the lab, it's this is what you're expected to do. The biggest difference for me is that there's no PhD students. I think I kind of like that. There's a lot less pressure. And the postdocs, and the other big cultural difference is I'm by far the youngest postdoc there. All the other postdocs, especially American postdocs, they've come out a 7-year PhD. And generally they are kind of just starting their careers. A lot of them have children. So it's a very kind of different setup than it is in the UK, where you can have postdocs again coming out of their PhD, but they're just younger. So I've learned to really learn off the other postdocs.
The long hours culture there, is that something that's been addressed as being a problem in the UK? Is it better or worse in the US?
In my institute, it's very good. But that's in my institute and that's with my boss. I can not talk. Other postdocs are working every day. So my boss is very much like, you don't need to. I don't think I need to be working that many hours. I felt like in my PhD, I kind of had to, because everything started working. I was like, oh, okay, I need to kind of finish all these experiments up kind of before I go to AAIC. But now I'm just getting what I can done. I'm working 40, 45, 50 hours a week, really. And I feel like I've got a much healthier work-life balance now. And I think that was something I learned from the consulting job. I learned in a consulting job, I was working 9 till 5:30 every day, Monday to Friday, and I did not take any work home in the evening, did not take any work home at the weekend. And I realized it's actually quite nice to have that free time. So I think that came very much from me in terms of whether I wanted to kind of fit in with that kind of culture. But I remember just before we shut down, I was working a lot because I was like, okay, I want to finish up some experiments before the shutdown to get a bit more data so I can analyze it kind of while I'm working from home. So I think the culture is there in the US, but it's kind of what you make of it. And I think people understand that you're not American. So for example, there's a big culture here about having an iPhone, more so than in the UK. It kind of blows my mind. And I was chatting to this guy and he said, why do you have an Android phone? And he was like, well, because if I saw someone who didn't have an iPhone in the US, I'd think different of them than someone and they just have these weird kind of cultural norms here that I'm learning about slowly.
And you can see how the work might change over time. Obviously, in a new city and a new place, you probably tend to, occupy your time more with work until you develop your social life. Thank you for that question, Honor. Jacob Dundee asks, advice for networking at conference. Did you approach many PIs, or were the one you mainly approached? Did you approach many potential PIs, or were the one you mainly approached?
I'm assuming what that means is, do you approach loads, 100, or do you approach 10? I honestly did not approach a single person that I did not want to work with at a conference, if that makes sense. I approached I think I got 6 postdoc offers in total. I think I counted it out once. I mean, not all of them were concrete offers, but they were saying, do you want to come work with us? And that was the initial conversation was there about kind of working in that group. And I had good interactions with each of those people. Very much I went and spoke to them, or they came and spoke to me. I found out about their research and vice versa. I think having those much more kind of targeted conversations is a lot better than just running around saying, give me a postdoc, because unfortunately desperation kind of rubs off. You know, if you're running around saying, I need a postdoc, I need a postdoc, PIs aren't going to give you the light of day because they're thinking, well, they would have reached out to me 6 months ago, you know. So I think having a kind of a much more clear strategy, and you just don't know where they're going to come from. Me getting an email 7 months after attending AIC saying, do I want to do a postdoc because someone got money, sometimes you just don't know where they're going to come from. So having those kind of good interactions, getting a business card, giving a business card, getting an email, sending an email, always follow up with these people after the conference.
I think what you mentioned before about the funding, about having to pay for your own travel costs, I suppose if you are thinking about doing a postdoc overseas, I think being prepared for the fact that you might have to fund yourself to go out there if you are wanting to spend time in the lab and do those things is something to try and budget ahead for, I guess, if you can, obviously. And you know, if they're very serious about taking you, if they are willing to pay for your working holiday, so to speak.
Yeah.
Okay. So the next question is from Domicili Lukawa. I'm rubbish at pronouncing these names. Any tips for someone who has moved to a different country while finishing their PhD, how one can go about approaching a supervisor for a position? Do you want to take that question first?
Yes. So again, just email and say, do you have half an hour to chat over Skype? You know, instead of like changing the, like transitioning away from being the, because unfortunately right now, we're not going to conferences. I very much doubt there's going to be a conference this year anywhere. So I think we've all got to kind of reassess how we're going about these interactions. I was fortunate that I was doing all of this when there wasn't a pandemic going on outside. But having like just sending an email to the PI and saying, I'm really interested in your research. Do you have 20, 30 minutes to grab a coffee over Zoom at some point in the coming weeks? If you're super busy at the moment, do you want to put me in touch with one of your PhD students, one of your postdocs, talk about what the research is going on in the lab? Because I know like my boss would not instigate that conversation because she's super busy doing all the COVID work. So she would just send an email to me and say, oh, James can talk to you about coming and working with us. And just there's a lot of people you can talk to who will be able to kind of get your foot in the door. So I wouldn't be necessarily worried that you're in a different country, because currently every single person right now is essentially working from home. We're not going out meeting people. We have to do all of this online. So I think it's going to be the new norm. I was talking to Adam yesterday. A lot of people are kind of doing interviews still, but over Zoom, over Skype. So it's really kind of out there for the taking. Yeah,
I think that's a good point there. And I think we might have actually answered the second point of this question. So Domicili Lukawa asks another question in an interview, given 10 minutes, what do you think would be the most important thing in your if you only had 10 minutes?
I really think kind of a brief 1 or 2 minutes about what you've done before. It's the same thing. It's a 50-50. Try and, or maybe even less, talk about your PhD, what you hope to do in the postdoc, and a little bit about you, and just bringing something to make you a bit more memorable. We all kind of we judge people a lot about kind of how they are in terms of their human interaction. Fortunately and unfortunately, because some people can come across really well in an interview and be awful kind of working within the lab. So you can kind of use that to your advantage and just kind of try and come across as well as possible.
Do you need to make yourself memorable? Do you need to get yourself a hook? You know, be the guy that wears bow ties, or the woman that always wears rainbows, or you know.
I don't know necessarily a hook is the most kind of important thing, but it definitely helps you stand out. But then if they're interested in you, most PIs, from what I can see, some people put out a job advert and they have 50 people apply to work in their lab. But everyone I approached, it was very much like they kind of made the position for me. So depending on kind of what you're doing, you might not even need the hook. You might just need to show that you're kind of a real human being. It depends on where you are in that kind of trajectory.
I think certainly having read things by the person you're approaching would certainly be helpful to at least know what space they're in. Okay, we have a question from Martha Mampy, who asks, with most conferences cancelled due to COVID-19, are there any other networking opportunities you would recommend? That's a good one. Do you know what? I've got an answer to this one, which is writing blogs. And this isn't just a plug for Dementia Researcher, who you're always welcome to write blogs for us. But I think building up your presence, following the right people, tweeting intelligently, with thought behind it, making those connections in that way is an opportunity, certainly. Doing webinars like this, of course, these get shared, they're out there on YouTube for a while, and building up your profile, then at least I think maybe gives you that thin connection to people to be able to point to it, or people might pick up on you. If you wanted to come and present your PhD work in one of our webinars, it's the next best thing to presenting at a conference. There might not be the two-way conversation in the same way, but if somebody sees you doing this and they think that was good, they might approach you, right? I don't know. Have you got other suggestions for that, James?
No, I think they're all really, really good tips. I just think, honestly, I think Twitter, LinkedIn, ResearchGate, all of these things can be super helpful. And in terms of, there are events going on that I've seen that I'm kind of trying to get involved in where I can. And make your own networking. If there's someone you want to work for, just send them an email. They're either crazy busy right now or they've got a load of free time. Hopefully not many people are going to be falling somewhere in between, but if they are super busy and they send you a response saying, I'm really sorry that I'm crazy for the next month or so, but reach out to me then, just reply and say, that's absolutely fine. Is there someone else in the lab I could talk to? If they have time available, then maybe try and organize just a 15-20 minute chat. In terms of kind of like overall networking, I've been going to, there's a company in Boston called AdGene. So they organize, they're basically a repository for genes, and they do really, really good kind of career development webinars. So just give yourself like an hour a week to sit in on a webinar about career development, management, or networking, or all of these different things is a good kind of way to be spending your time if you are available to kind of use that time.
And this is, in terms of right now with the lockdown, this is the perfect time to do that. There seems to be a myriad of different webinars out there for you to participate about career and personal development. And of course, the institutions where you are currently doing your PhDs will also have careers departments that are doing these things as well to help you with CVs and funding applications if you have to find your own funding and other things. Last 2 points. Ed Pinchers, I think, is also from Alzheimer's Research UK. Hi, Ed. He says,
Hey, Ed.
Thank you very much. And then we've got one last question from Ruth Anfull, who asked tips for getting positive feedback in search of a position. Do you have any tips for getting positive feedback?
I think positive feedback, well, that's a job, isn't it? You know, I don't think you want positive feedback. I think you just want a job. I don't really know if I would want positive feedback, because technically everything you're doing should be kind of warranting that feedback. I think just showing that you're approachable, that you're a human, and that you kind of understand that it's a long process hiring somebody. I kind of only learned about it kind of while applying. I kind of thought there was a job advert that you applied to, or that they just wrote you a CV, or they wrote you a contract out there and then. But I think having those kind of one-on-one interactions, knowing your science is the obvious one, knowing their science is another obvious one. I remember I read the 3 or 4 papers, most recent papers from the group. I searched the lab websites, try and glean as much information as I could from them. And I kind of thought about how I could get my own money in the future, where I wanted to take the project. All of these things just show that you are like thinking about not only what you've done before, what you hope to do in the next year, what you hope to do kind of in the coming years. And they'll reach out to your references as well. I was like fortunate that my PhD supervisor, he gave me a really glowing reference. So I think just keeping everyone on side and warning people that would be getting approached for references about that you may be contacted by this group or this group is a good thing to do. And feel free to do practice interviews. That's really a great time to be doing them right now. I'm happy to kind of run through a practice interview or just something similar.
That's an offer you might live to regret.
but yeah, but I mean, it's just, you'd be like, even if it's just like running through like how someone's thinking, because I remember I got the postdoc the old postdoc in my lab to look over my presentation, and if she hadn't looked over it, she gave some really good feedback, because I was like, am I being too personal in this? Am I talking about, do people care that I went to Machu Picchu? But she said, no, that's a really good thing to do. And I think having that validation is a really good thing. So just having someone who's like a little bit higher up than you to have a look over what you've done and say, is this acceptable? Yeah.
And that's a good actual point to get a plug in, that Dementia Researcher as a service, we do have a WhatsApp group as well, which has got 103 at the moment, I think, early career researchers at varying stages from PhDs to
join that.
Senior fellows and postdocs in there. And they're a really friendly, open group of people. So if you are wanting somebody to look over your CV or to take a quick glance at a grant application, whatever you're working on, by all means, you'll find details on how to join our WhatsApp group on our website. I think there's a link at the top that says Ask an Expert. Details on how to join the community are there, and by all means do post there. Okay, I think that's all we've got time for today. So thank you very much, James, for agreeing to share with us. If anybody has any questions, you can find James on Twitter, and his Twitter name is @tweetwithquinn, 2 N's on the end. And we'll also be posting a recording from today's webinar on our website sometime tomorrow. Our next webinar will be on Wednesday, the 22nd of April, with Dr. Courtney Genge, discussing the 5 pillars of dementia-friendly emergency department. The recording from today and details on future webinars can be found on our website at dementiaresearcher.nihr.ac.uk/webinars. Finally, if you'd like to join us, as I hinted at earlier, and present your own research as a midday lecture, or write a blog for us, or even come and record a podcast with us, please just drop us a line using the details on the contact page of our website, or you can DM us on Twitter using @dem_researcher. Thank you very much, everybody, again for joining us today, and thank you very much, James. There's a few more thank yous in there from Jacob and Martha and Rory. Thank you very much, everybody, and we'll see you again next week.
Yeah, thank you everyone for listening to me ramble for 20 minutes. And thanks, Adam, for organising this. It's a really good kind of initiative at the moment.
That's cool. Thank you.
Brilliant. Have a good day, everyone. Bye.